Can you protect me? She was 82 years old. One eye swollen shut, purple to the cheekbone. She'd walked 4 blocks in her slippers to a bar full of men the whole town crossed the street to avoid, because they were the only people left she wasn't afraid of. She didn't want money. She didn't want the police. She'd tried the police. She slid a folded napkin across the bar, and on it, in shaking handwriting, was a single room number. Room 114, she whispered. Before they move me tonight. Nobody at that bar knew yet what was waiting behind that door. Before we go one step further, I want to know something. Wherever you are right now, whatever town, whatever state, whatever corner of this country or this world you're watching from, do me a favor and drop it in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from. Because a story like this one doesn't belong to one place. There's an Opal Hargrove in every town in America, an old woman somebody decided had stopped being worth listening to, and I want to see just how many of us are out here who still believe she's worth standing up for. So say it, your city, your state, your country, put it down below, and let's see how far this reaches. And while you're down there, if you believe an 82-year-old woman should never have to walk 4 blocks in the rain to be believed, hit that subscribe button. This channel will always take her side. The cowards can keep scrolling. The rest of us are staying right here because you are going to want to see how this one ends. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to a gray Tuesday morning, to a low brick building at the edge of a tired little town, to a room full of the most feared men in the county. And to the moment a frightened old woman with a bruise she couldn't explain pushed open the door and changed all of their lives, and none of them saw it coming. This is the story of the day 50 of the most dangerous men in America went to war for a stranger and found out she was never a stranger at all. The rain had been coming down since before dawn, the kind of slow, patient rain that doesn't so much fall as settle, soaking into the seams of a town that had long ago stopped expecting much from a Tuesday. On the edge of that town, where the county road gave up its ambitions and turned to gravel, there was a low brick building with a hand-painted sign and a gravel lot full of motorcycles. And inside that building sat a dozen men that most people in those parts had spent their whole lives learning to avoid. You know the type, or you think you do. Leather worn soft as skin, beards gone gray at the edges, ink that told stories nobody had asked to hear. When these men rode 2 abreast down Main Street, mothers found reasons to be somewhere else, and shopkeepers found reasons to stand a little closer to their registers, and the good and decent people of the town crossed to the other side of the road without ever quite admitting to themselves that that was what they were doing. It was easier that way. It was easier to look at a man in a cut and a chain wallet and decide you already knew everything worth knowing about him. But this is a story about the difference between what a man looks like and what a man is. And it begins on that gray Tuesday morning, in that brick building, with the smell of engine oil and burnt coffee and rain, and with an old woman none of them had ever seen before pushing open the door. The man they all answered to was named Duke Mallory, though almost nobody called him that anymore. They called him Preacher, and they called him that for a reason. He was 63 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way that older strong men get, his hands scarred from 4 decades of wrenching on machines that fought back. He kept a worn Bible in his saddlebag and a photograph of a dead brother in his wallet, and he had a way of going quiet before he spoke that made a whole room go quiet with him. He was sitting at the far end of the bar that morning with a cup of black coffee cooling between his palms, listening to the young ones argue about nothing the way young men do, and he was the first to notice that the door had opened and that the rain had let something in. She was small. That was the first thing. Small and stooped and 82 years old, in a thin cardigan that hadn't been warm enough for the weather in years, and house slippers that were soaked black through to the sole. She had walked there. You could see it in her, in the way she stood dripping in the doorway with her chest rising and falling too fast, one hand pressed flat against the frame like the door was the only thing holding her up. Her hair was white and neat and coming loose at the edges. And her face was what stopped the room, because one eye was swollen nearly shut. The skin around it had gone the deep, bruised purple of a plum, spreading down across the cheekbone, the kind of mark that doesn't come from a stumble against a nightstand no matter what anybody tells you. She stood there in the doorway of a bar full of the most dangerous-looking men in the county, an 82-year-old woman with a black eye, and one by one the arguments died, and the laughter died, and the whole room turned to look at her. And the strangest thing happened. Not one of those men moved toward her. Not one of them raised his voice. or made a joke, or did any of the 100 careless things a frightened old woman might have braced herself for. They went still. All of them. Big men gone motionless, and quiet the way you go quiet around a wounded thing you don't want to spook. And in that stillness there was something the old woman must have recognized, because she let go of the door frame, and she took a step, and then another, straight down the length of that silent room, toward the oldest man in it. She stopped in front of Preacher. Up close her hands were shaking. He could see the tremor in them, could see the way she clutched a small vinyl purse against the front of her cardigan with both arms wrapped around it like it held everything she had left in the world. She looked up at him with the one eye she could still open all the way, and her voice, when it finally came, was barely more than a breath. "Can you protect me?" For words. That was all. Preacher didn't answer right away. He'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to lose a frightened person's trust was to promise them something before you understood what you were promising. So he sat with it, and he held her gaze, and he let the question hang there in the quiet. And she must have taken his silence for doubt, because she said it again, softer, and this time she added something that made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. "They told me I fell," she whispered. "They keep telling me I fell." She said it the way a person says a lie they've been forced to repeat so many times it started to wear a groove in them. "They told me I fell. Not I fell. Not I had an accident. They told me." Somebody had sat this woman down with that mark blooming across her face and instructed her, gently or otherwise, on what she was to say had happened to her. And she had walked 4 blocks in the rain in her slippers to a room full of strangers rather than say it one more time. Preacher set his coffee down on the bar. He did it slowly, deliberately, the ceramic clicking against the wood in a room, so quiet you could hear the rain on the roof. He leaned forward, and he looked at that ruined eye, at the deep print of the bruise, and when he spoke his voice had gone low and flat, and even, stripped of everything but the 2 words underneath it. Who did this? It wasn't a question. There was no rise at the end of it, no room in it for maybe. It was the sound of a door closing somewhere, quiet and final, the sound of a decision being made before anyone in that room had heard a single detail of what had actually happened. Who did this? The old woman's chin trembled. Her mouth opened. "I'm going to stop us right here for a moment, because I need to say something, and I need to say it before you hear another word of what she told them." Somebody put that mark on the face of an 82-year-old woman, and then they looked her in the eye and taught her to call it a fall. If that turns your stomach the way it turned the stomach of every man in that room, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. This channel stands with people like Miss Opal, the ones the world stops listening to, the ones who get told they imagined it. The cowards can keep scrolling. The rest of us are staying right here. Because you're going to want to see how this ends. Now, let me tell you who she was. Her name was Opal Hargrove, and until 3 years before that rainy morning, she had lived a quiet, unremarkable, and by every account happy life in a small yellow house on the north side of town. She had been married for 51 years to a man named Raymond, and if you had asked anyone who knew them, they'd have told you that Opal and Raymond Hargrove were about as devoted a pair as this world tends to produce. He had gone off to a war as a young man and come home changed, the way they all came home changed, quieter and harder and carrying things he never fully set down. But he'd built a life with her anyway, brick by brick, and she had been the soft place he came home to for half a century. And then, 3 years ago, Raymond died, and the yellow house got very big and very quiet. And a few months after that, Opal's daughter, who lived 4 states away and had her own 3 children and her own drowning list of obligations, began to worry about her mother living alone. There'd been an incident with the stove left on, a missed appointment, a phone call where Opal couldn't quite find a word she was reaching for. And so, with the best of intentions and the heaviest of hearts, the daughter had arranged for her mother to move into a care facility on the edge of town, a place called Cedar Hollow, a place with a nice brochure and a reasonable monthly rate, and a lobby that smelled of lemon cleaner and, underneath it, very faintly, of something else. Here is the thing you have to understand about Opal Hargrove, the thing that everyone around her had somehow stopped being able to see. Her mind was not slipping. Not really. Yes, she'd left the stove on once. She was grieving, and grieving people do that. Yes, she reached for words sometimes. She was 82, and so will you be, if you're lucky. But the woman was sharp. She read 2 newspapers a day. She did the crossword in pen. She remembered the birthdays of people who had forgotten her own. And she had figured out sitting in her half of a shared room at Cedar Hollow. That something at that facility was very, very wrong, long before she ever walked into that bar. But nobody believes the elderly. That's the quiet cruelty at the center of this whole story, and it's a cruelty a lot of you watching already know in your bones. There is a moment, if you live long enough, when the world decides it has heard enough from you, when your worry becomes confusion, and your certainty becomes one of her spells, and the truest thing you have ever said gets patted on the hand and set aside. Opal had crossed into that country the day she moved into Cedar Hollow, and she knew it, and there is no lonelier place on this earth. When they got her calmed down at the bar, wrapped in somebody's flannel-lined jacket that swallowed her whole, with a cup of hot coffee she was too shaky to drink, she talked a little. Not about the eye, she wouldn't go near the eye yet, but about her life, about Raymond. And when she said his name, her hand went up to her collar, and her fingers found something under the fabric, and she held onto it the way she'd held onto that purse. It was a chain. On the end of it, tucked warm against her chest where she'd worn it every day for 3 years, was a pair of military dog tags. Raymond's. She rubbed the metal between her thumb and forefinger without seeming to know she was doing it, an old habit worn smooth, and she looked at the men around her, and she said, so quietly that only the nearest ones caught it, "My Raymond would have known what to do. He always knew what to do." One of them asked, gently, who Raymond was, what he'd done. And a strange look crossed the old woman's face, something guarded, something almost like a secret being held close. And she just shook her head and closed her fingers around the tags, and she said, "He's gone now. It doesn't matter." And she wouldn't say another word about him. Not his work, not his history, not why a woman who claimed to have no one had walked past the police station and the fire department and every respectable door in that town to come find these particular men. She just held on to her dead husband's tags and looked at the floor. Remember that. Remember the tags and the way she wouldn't explain them. Because it's going to matter more than you can possibly imagine. There was a woman riding with the club in those days, the only woman who wore a full patch, a woman in her 40s named Ray, who before she ever threw a leg over a motorcycle had spent 11 years working the emergency room of a county hospital 2 towns over. She had held people together, literally, with her hands. She had seen every kind of wound a human body can suffer and every kind of lie people tell about how they got them. And while the men were being gentle and getting Opal her coffee, Ray had been doing something else. She'd been watching that eye. She crouched down in front of the old woman, slow and easy, and she asked if she could take a look, and Opal, who had spent 3 years being disbelieved, let this stranger tilt her chin toward the light. Ray studied the bruise for a long moment, and when she stood back up, her jaw had gone tight, and she caught Preacher's eye across the room, and she gave a small shake of her head. "That's not a fall," she said. Quiet, so the old woman wouldn't hear the whole of it. "I've seen 1,000 falls. A fall catches the cheekbone, the brow, the side. You go down, you hit a flat surface, the bruise spreads wide and shallow." She looked back at that deep, concentrated mark high on Opal's face. "That's not wide and shallow. That's tight. That's focused. That's the shape of a knuckle." She let that sit. Somebody hit her. Somebody who knew enough to hit her where a sleeve or a little powder might cover it, and then told her to say she fell. And just like that, the warmth in that room turned into something colder and harder and a great deal more dangerous. The young ones wanted to ride. That's the truth of it. There was a member named Boone, 30-odd years old, the newest full patch in the club, quick to laugh and quicker to anger, and Boone was already on his feet before Ray had finished talking. He wanted names. He wanted the address of wherever this had happened. He wanted to point 50 motorcycles at whoever had done this and let them feel, for one afternoon, a fraction of the fear that old woman had been carrying. And you understand him, don't you? Part of you is on your feet with him. But Preacher put a hand up, and Boone sat back down, because that's how it worked with Preacher. The old man had been doing this a long time. He'd watched good intentions ruin lives. He'd watched men storm off half-cocked in the name of justice, and hand the guilty party exactly the excuse they needed to walk away clean. "We don't scare an old woman's caretakers on a hunch," he said. "Look at her. She's terrified of something bigger than a bruise. We go in there hot. We knock some fella around in a parking lot. And what happens? He's the victim. We're the animals everybody already thinks we are, and she," he nodded at Opal without looking away from Boone, "she pays for it after we're gone. We find the truth first. All of it. Because once we move, there's no walking it back. And when we do move, I want it to land on the right man, and I want it to land so it stays landed. So they made a plan, and it was a quiet one. Two of them. Preacher himself, and Ray, because Ray could read a medical chart and a frightened staffer better than any of them, would drive out to Cedar Hollow that very afternoon. Not on the bikes, not in colors, just a nice older couple come to visit their Aunt Opal, all smiles and a box of chocolates, the kind of visitors nobody looks at twice. They'd get inside. They'd see what there was to see. And it was right about then, as they were talking it through, that Opal reached out and caught Ray's sleeve. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and the fear came back into her face all at once, worse than before, and she said the thing that turned a plan into a race. "Whatever you're going to do," she said, "you have to do it today. Please. Before tonight." Her voice cracked. "They're moving me tonight. They told me this morning. They're moving me somewhere else, somewhere far, and they wouldn't tell me where," and she stopped and swallowed, and the next words came out of her like they cost her something. "Once I'm gone, nobody's going to be able to find me. I know how it works now. I've watched it happen to others. If I leave that building tonight, I am never going to be heard from again." Preacher looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the clock on the wall of the bar. It was not yet noon. They expected, driving out there, to find a tired old building and a misunderstanding, a stressed-out staff, maybe one bad apple, a situation they could straighten out with a firm conversation and a watchful eye. What they were about to walk into was a man who had been getting away with it for years. Cedar Hollow Care Home sat at the end of a long drive lined with trees that somebody had planted decades ago, hoping they'd look stately, and now just looked tired. It was a single-story brick sprawl, beige and low, with a wheelchair ramp and a flower bed that had been recently, aggressively tidied, the way things get tidied when they're meant to be looked at rather than enjoyed. Preacher parked the sedan they'd borrowed. Nobody at Cedar Hollow needed to see a motorcycle, and he and Ray walked in through the front doors with a box of chocolates and a rehearsed smile. A nice couple here to see their Aunt Opal. The lobby smelled of lemon cleaner. And underneath the lemon, faint but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent time in the places we warehouse the old, there was that other smell, the one no amount of cleaner ever fully covers. The smell of too many people and too few hands. The smell of neglect wearing a clean shirt. The man who came out to greet them was the administrator, and his name was Dale Renner, and he was, on the surface of things, everything you'd want such a man to be. 50s. Trim. A good haircut and a better handshake and a smile that arrived exactly on cue and left exactly on cue and never quite reached his eyes. He wore a lanyard and a pressed shirt, and he spoke the smooth, frictionless language of a man who has never once in his life been held accountable for anything. He was, in a word, charming. And I want you to sit with how much scarier that is than a monster. A monster you can see coming. A man like Dale Renner shakes your hand and calls you by name and makes you feel, for just a moment, like you're the one being unreasonable. He told them, "Oh, of course, Opal, lovely woman, though I should tell you she does get confused. She says things sometimes, you mustn't take it too much to heart." He said it warmly. He said it like a kindness. He was, in that one gentle sentence, doing the same thing to Preacher and Ray that had been done to Opal for 3 years, laying the groundwork so that whatever the old woman said next could be safely set aside. But Ray was watching the staff, and the staff would not look at her. A young aide pushing a cart dropped her eyes the moment Ray caught them. A nurse at the station found something urgent to do with her hands. There was a fear in that building, low and constant, humming under the lemon smell, and it wasn't the residents who were afraid of the staff. It was the staff who were afraid of Renner. They found Opal's room, and Preacher's jaw tightened at the door because the room was half torn down already. Her side of it. The small, careful world an old woman builds in the corner of a shared room was in boxes. Her clothes folded into a cardboard box. Her few framed photographs stacked and wrapped. A suitcase open on the stripped bed. They really were moving her. Tonight, just like she'd said. The thing she'd been too confused to be believed about was happening in cardboard and packing tape right in front of them. It was in the hallway, on the way back out, that a small thing happened that told them everything. An old man in a wheelchair, parked by a window, waited until Renner had stepped away to take a call, and then he reached out and caught Ray's hand as she passed. His grip was papery and urgent. He pulled her down close, and he whispered, with his eyes darting toward the office door, "They move the ones who complain." That was all. They move the ones who complain. And then Renner's footsteps came back down the hall, and the old man let go of her hand and turned his face back to the window and became, instantly, just another quiet resident staring at the rain, and he would not look at her again. I need you to comment something for me right now. If you believe an 82-year-old woman deserves better than a man who hides behind a clipboard and a smile while he packs her life into boxes, type "not on my watch" in the comments. Right now, I want to see how many of us are standing in that hallway with her. I want Dale Renner to feel the weight of every single one of us. Go ahead. I'll wait. Now, there was one more member of the Cedar Hollow staff that Preacher and Ray needed to meet, though they didn't know it yet, and they met him almost by accident, coming around a corner near the residents' rooms. He was a night shift orderly, though he was there in the daytime that day, which was its own small strange note. His name was Grady Voss. He was somewhere in his 30s, big through the arms, with a restless quality to him, eyes that moved too much. And the moment he came around that corner and saw two strangers standing near Opal's room, something flickered across his face. There and gone, but Ray caught it. Guilt has a look. She'd spent 11 years learning it. But here's what told her the most. It wasn't Grady's face. It was Opal's. Because the old woman was sitting in a chair in the common room just then, and Grady passed near her on his way down the hall, and Ray watched Opal Hargrove, who had walked into a bar full of the roughest men in the county without flinching, go rigid. Watched her shrink. Watched her pull her arms in tight, and drop her eyes to her lap, and make herself small. The way a person makes themselves small around the specific individual who has taught them what happens when they don't. Renner glided over, smooth as ever, and put a hand on the orderly's shoulder. "Grady here is one of our best," he said, smiling. "The residents love him." And Grady smiled too, on cue, and Opal stared at her hands, and Ray felt the whole shape of the thing click into place a half-second before she had the proof. The proof was on Renner's desk. When he stepped into his office to retrieve some paperwork, "Visitor forms," he said, "just a formality." Ray's eyes, trained by 1,000 hospital charts to read a document upside down and at a glance, found a page half buried under others. It was a bank statement, Opal Hargrove's name at the top, and a column of withdrawals. Regular, steady, sums that meant nothing to a wealthy man and everything to an old woman living on a fixed income and the memory of a soldier's pension. Withdrawals she would never in 100 years have authorized, draining an account she probably still believed had a little something in it for a rainy day. And in the space of one breath, the whole story turned itself inside out, and every ugly piece of it fell into place. They weren't stealing from Opal because she was confused. They were calling Opal confused because they were stealing from her. Cedar Hollow, or at least the men who ran it, had found the perfect victims. Old people with money and no one watching. The ones whose children lived 4 states away. The ones whose worried families had signed the paperwork and gone home relieved that mom was somewhere safe. Renner had been quietly, patiently draining them, month after month, and the ones who noticed, the ones who complained, the ones who got sharp and asked the wrong questions, those were the ones who got moved. Transferred somewhere far, off the map, where a confused old person's confused complaints would trouble no one ever again. And the black eye had never been random at all. Opal, sharp Opal, reading her 2 newspapers and doing her crossword in pen, had gotten suspicious. She'd started watching, and one evening she had come back to her room and found Grady Voss inside it, going through her things. Her drawers, her purse, the small places an old woman hides what little she has left. She'd caught him. She'd opened her mouth to say so, and Grady had made sure, with one short, focused blow, that she understood exactly what saying so would cost her. Then he'd told her she'd fallen, and the machinery of "she gets confused" did the rest. She wasn't being moved tonight for her health. She was being moved because she knew. Because she'd become a problem that needed to disappear before she could become a problem anyone believed. Before tonight, she'd begged them at the bar, and now that plea meant something entirely different than it had that morning. It was never the fear of a new building. It was the fear of being silenced, of vanishing into the system that had already stopped listening to her, so completely that even the men who wanted to help her might never find her again. If you cannot stand a thief who preys on the people least able to fight back, the old, the frail, the ones who trusted a smiling man with a lanyard, then type "no more lies" in the comments right now. I mean it. Every single one of those is a vote against Dale Renner. Every one is a voice for a woman who spent 3 years being told her own eyes were lying to her. Say it. No more lies. Now here is the terrible part. The part that had Preacher gripping the steering wheel white-knuckled on the drive back. Because knowing a thing and being able to stop it are two very different animals. Renner held all the cards, and he held them legally. He had the paperwork. He had policy. He had a facility full of documentation, doctored just enough, that described Opal Hargrove as a declining, confused, occasionally combative resident whose family had consented to her care and, if it came to it, to her transfer. He had a doctor's note he could produce. He had, most chilling of all, the power to begin the process of having her declared mentally unfit. And once that stamp came down, everything Opal said forever after would be legally, officially, the ramblings of a woman who couldn't be trusted to know what day it was. And he'd made his position clear before they left, in that same smooth, smiling voice, with just the faintest edge of steel underneath. He'd noticed, he said, that Opal seemed to have made some new friends, some rather colorful friends. He did hope no one was going to harass his staff or disturb his residents, because Cedar Hollow took the safety of its people very seriously, and he wouldn't hesitate to involve the authorities, a restraining order, perhaps, if anyone came around making trouble. He smiled when he said it. He was, in effect, telling them, I know exactly what you are, and the law will side with the man in the press shirt over the men on the motorcycles every single time, and we both know it. He was right. That was the worst of it. On paper, in the eyes of every system built to sort the respectable from the rest, Dale Renner was a caregiver, and the men who wanted to protect Opal were a threat. Muscle wasn't going to win this. Fear wasn't going to win this. You cannot punch a bank statement. You cannot intimidate a legal guardianship. Preacher understood, sitting in that car, that everything he'd spent his life being good at was useless here, and that they had until nightfall. Boone nearly cost them everything in the parking lot. Because the young ones had come out anyway, a few of them, hanging back, waiting for word. And when Grady Voss stepped out for a smoke, and Boone got a look at the man who'd put his fist into an 82-year-old woman's face, something in him came loose. He crossed that lot fast. He got right up into Grady's space, close enough to smell the cigarette, his whole body a cocked fist, and Grady flinched back against the wall with his eyes gone wide. And for one heartbeat the entire thing hung on the edge of a knife. It was Ray who caught Boone's arm. Ray, who'd seen where roads like this one led. She didn't shout. She just got her hand around his forearm and put her mouth close to his ear and said, low and hard, You hit him, and we lose her. Look at me. That is exactly what Renner wants. He wants a picture of an animal in a leather cut assaulting his staff. You give him that, and tonight she disappears, and it's your fist that sent her. Boone stood there shaking. And then, slowly, he stepped back. He unclenched. He walked away, and Grady Voss slid along the wall and hurried back inside. And the moment passed, and it was the hardest thing that young man had ever done, and it may have been the thing that saved Opal Hargrove's life. They went back to the bar with nothing. No leverage. No plan. A clock running down toward a nightfall that would swallow an old woman whole. And it was there, in the low light of that brick room, that Preacher remembered the purse. Because Opal had left it with them. That little vinyl purse she'd clutched to her chest all morning. When they'd driven out to Cedar Hollow, she'd pressed it into Ray's hands and asked her to keep it safe, and in the chaos of everything else they'd nearly forgotten it. Now Preacher set it on the bar and opened it, gently, the way you'd open something that belonged to your own mother. And he took the pieces of her life out one at a time. A handkerchief, a worn coin purse with almost nothing in it, a folded newspaper clipping, a tube of lipstick in a shade women her age had worn since before he was born, and taped to the inside of the purse, flat against the vinyl where she could feel it was still there without ever having to take it out, was a photograph. It was old. The color had gone the warm, faded orange of a picture from decades back. It showed a crowd of men, leather, denim, beards, boots. 30, 40, 50 of them, gathered on the steps of a little country church, grinning at the camera the way men grin when one of their own has done something right. And at the center of them stood a couple. A young woman in a simple white dress, dark-haired, laughing, radiant. And beside her, in a suit that didn't quite fit him, with a motorcycle club's colors worn proudly over the top of it, a young groom. Preacher went very still, because he knew that patch. He knew that patch the way you know your own name. It was the club's colors, his club's colors, but the old design. The original design. A version of the patch that had been retired 40 years ago, before most of the men in that room were born, worn only by the founding handful who'd started the whole thing in a garage back, when it was nothing but a few restless veterans looking for brothers who understood. His eyes went to the groom's face, and then to the small brass nameplate someone had pinned beneath the photo, the way you'd label a picture in a place of honor. Raymond Ironwood Hargrove. Preacher had to sit down. Ironwood. He'd heard that name his whole riding life. A name spoken with reverence by the oldest members. One of the men who'd built the thing they all belonged to. A founding brother. Gone before Preacher ever earned his own patch. Ironwood. And Opal. Small, terrified, disbelieved Opal, with her dead husband's dog tags worn warm against her chest. Opal was Ironwood's widow. She was not a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. She was family. She was the most family a woman could be to that club, the wife of one of its fathers, and she had walked 4 blocks in the rain in her slippers to ask them for protection, and not one of them had known who she was, because after Raymond died, she had been too proud, and too gentle, and too afraid of being a burden, to ever say the words, "Your founder was my husband. I am one of yours." My Raymond would have known what to do. That was why she'd come to them, and only them. Not the police. Not the fire station. She'd walked past every door in town to reach the one family her Raymond had left her, the brotherhood he'd helped build, because some part of her had believed, had hoped, that his people would still be her people, even now, even after everything. For a long moment nobody in that bar said anything at all. Preacher held the photograph in his scarred hands and looked at the face of a brother he'd never met and the bride who'd become the old woman in the boxes at Cedar Hollow. And when he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Whatever this had been that morning, a kindness, a good deed, a rescue, it wasn't that anymore. It had become the only thing that mattered more to those men than their own lives. "Get everyone," Preacher said. Quiet. Final. Not loud, because it didn't need to be loud. Every patch. Every prospect. Every brother who can throw a leg over a machine. I don't care what they're doing or where they are. He set the photograph down on the bar, face up, where all of them could see the founder and his bride. "We ride at 4. And the word went out. It went out the way word goes out among people bound by something the rest of the world doesn't have a name for. A phone call, then another, then a dozen. Men in garages set down their wrenches. Men at kitchen tables stood up mid-sentence and reached for their jackets while their wives, who had learned long ago what that particular phone call meant, started the coffee and asked no questions. A man on a job site handed his shift to somebody and walked to his bike. It spread across the county in the space of an hour, this quiet gathering of the unlikeliest cavalry that ever rode, and every single one of them, when they heard whose widow it was, said some version of the same thing. Ironwood's wife, and nobody knew? Fuel up. I'm coming. But here is the part that matters most, the part that separates this story from a story about revenge. While the men were gathering their thunder, Ray was building the thing that would actually win. Because Ray understood what Preacher understood, that 50 motorcycles couldn't beat a bank statement. So she got on the phone, and she called a woman she knew at Adult Protective Services, an investigator who'd spent her career trying to protect exactly the people Cedar Hollow was preying on, and she laid it out. The withdrawals. The bruise she'd read with her own trained eyes. The old man in the wheelchair. They moved the ones who complain. And then Ray made one more call, to a reporter at the county paper, a young woman hungry for the kind of story that actually meant something. The plan was not violence. The plan was witnesses. 50 riders and an investigator and a reporter, all arriving at the same moment, in broad daylight, at a place whose entire operation depended on darkness and silence, and nobody ever looking too closely. Renner's power was secrecy. His whole scheme lived in the shadows, in the gap between what an old person said and what anyone was willing to believe. And you cannot make a woman disappear quietly when there are 50 pairs of eyes and a notebook and a badge standing in your lobby at 3 in the afternoon. Before you hear what happened when they got there, I want you to do one thing. Reach over and share this video with one person, right now, one person you know who believes that bullies who target the elderly should never, ever get away with it. Just one. Because Miss Opal walked 4 blocks alone, in the rain, in her slippers, to find someone who would help her. She did the hardest part by herself. The very least the rest of us can do is make sure her story doesn't stay quiet the way Dale Renner needed it to stay quiet. Send it to one person. That's how the wall gets built. They fueled up. They lined up. And at 4 o'clock, engine by engine, that lot came alive with a sound you could feel in your chest from a quarter-mile off. At 3:58, Dale Renner looked out of his office window at Cedar Hollow, coffee in hand, comfortable in the certainty that had protected him for years, the certainty that men like him always win. And he saw the horizon go dark. He saw the far end of that long tree-lined drive fill with headlights, rank on rank of them, more than he could count, coming on slow and steady and unstoppable. His coffee stopped halfway to his mouth. He reached for the phone on his desk. It was already too late. They say it takes about 9 minutes for 50 motorcycles to fill a parking lot. 9 minutes from the moment the first bike turns in off the road to the moment the last one shuts down. If you have never stood in the middle of it, you cannot imagine what those 9 minutes do to a place. The sound arrives first, rolling up the drive ahead of them like weather, a deep synchronized thunder that rattled the windows of Cedar Hollow in their frames and brought residents to the glass and staff to the doors and Dale Renner out onto the front step with his lanyard and his smile finally, completely gone. And they came on, 2 by 2 up that tired old drive, headlights cutting through the gray afternoon, and they filled the lot rank by rank, wheeling into place with a precision that had nothing accidental about it, until there was no space left and the overflow lined the drive itself. 50 riders, 50 machines. And then, at a signal from the old man at the front, they cut the engines. All of them, at once. And the silence that came down after all that thunder was somehow the loudest thing of all. Because here is what Dale Renner had braced for, standing on that step: violence, chaos, an excuse. He had spent the drive of those headlights up his lane composing the phone call he'd make, the story he'd tell, the animals, the assault, the threat to his poor residents. He had been ready for men who would give him exactly what he needed. They gave him nothing. They didn't rush the doors. They didn't shout. They didn't raise a hand or a voice. 50 of the roughest-looking men and women in the county simply got off their machines and stood and became a wall. An immovable, silent, unbreakable wall of witnesses stretched across the whole front of that building, arms folded, faces set, saying not one word. They just stood there, in the daylight Renner had spent years hiding from, and they watched him. And while they held that silence, 3 people walked through the front doors of Cedar Hollow. Ray, the investigator from Adult Protective Services, badge out, a folder under her arm, and the young reporter, notebook already open, camera already up. They walked through the wall of leather and into the lemon-smelling lobby, and the wall closed behind them, and Dale Renner understood, in that moment, that the thing that had always protected him, the dark, the quiet, the fact that nobody ever looked, was gone, and it was never coming back. Inside, it came apart fast, the way these things do once the first thread is pulled. The investigator had a warrant of sorts and the authority to demand records, and the records were damning. It wasn't just Opal. It was a dozen residents. It was a steady, patient pattern of withdrawals from the accounts of exactly the people least likely to be missed. The ones with no visitors, no local family, no one to ask questions. It was incident reports that had been altered, falls that didn't match the injuries, transfers that led to facilities that, when the investigator started making calls, turned out never to have received the patients at all. Opal's own fall fell apart in minutes. Ray laid out the medical truth of that bruise, and then the reporter found the thing that ended it. A camera at the end of the residence corridor, a security camera Renner himself had installed, and then forgotten logged that hallway, that had recorded the evening Grady Voss walked into Opal Hargrove's room and walked out again while she stayed inside with a hand pressed to her face. Grady cracked first. They always do, the hands rather than the head. The ones who did the ugly work while somebody else kept the clean shirt and the good haircut. The moment he understood that the camera existed and the badge was real, Grady Voss started talking to save himself, and everything he said pointed straight up the ladder to Dale Renner. The policy was a scheme. The confusion was manufactured. The transfers were disappearances. Renner had built it, and Renner had run it, and Grady had just been the fist Renner didn't want to dirty his own hand with. And then came the piece that turned the whole story on its head one final time. Because when the investigator sat down with Opal Hargrove, really sat down, and did the thing no one at Cedar Hollow had done in 3 years, which was listen to her, Opal reached up to her collar, and she took off the chain she'd worn every day since Raymond died. The dog tags. And tucked behind them, folded so small and worn so soft it had nearly become part of the metal, was a piece of paper. It was a list. In Opal's own careful hand, the hand that did the crossword in pen. Dates. Dollar amounts. The name of every resident she'd noticed getting confused right before they got moved. The nights Grady worked. The times money went missing. Months of it. She had been keeping records. Opal Hargrove had never been confused at all. She had figured out, long before anyone came to help her, exactly what was happening in that building. And she had understood, with the hard clarity of a woman who knew nobody would believe her, that the only weapon she had left was the truth, written down, kept close, waiting for the day she found one single person who would take it seriously. She had played forgetful. She had let them think her mind was going, because a woman whose mind was going was a woman they'd underestimate, and an underestimated woman could watch, and count, and remember, and write it all down behind her dead husband's dog tags where no one would ever think to look. The bikers had not come to rescue a helpless victim. They had come to back up a woman who was already fighting, who had been fighting, alone and unheard and afraid, for longer than any of them had known she existed. All she had ever needed was for somebody to stand behind her long enough that the world was forced to listen. And now the world was listening. I want you to comment 3 words for me. I stand for justice. Type it right now, and type it loud, because I'll tell you who couldn't type it loud. Opal couldn't, not for 3 whole years. 3 years of knowing the truth and having no one believe a word of it. So say it for her. I stand for justice if you are not, and never will be, on the side of a man who stole from the people who trusted him most. Put it in the comments. Let her hear it. They led Dale Renner out through the front doors in the late afternoon light, and the bikers gave him the one thing they'd been holding back all along. Not fists, not words, silence. 50 pairs of eyes, tracking him every step of the way from the door to the waiting car, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. He kept his own eyes down. The smooth, smiling man who had never once been held accountable for anything walked that whole gauntlet with his shoulders up around his ears, and he did not look at a single one of them, because he could not. Grady went the same way, a few minutes later. And the great secret machine of Cedar Hollow, that had run so quietly for so long on the certainty that nobody would ever look, ground to a halt in the daylight with 50 witnesses watching it die. The facility was placed under investigation that very evening. Other residents came forward, the old man in the wheelchair first, and then others, once they understood that the ones who complained weren't going to disappear anymore. Families 4 states away got phone calls that made them go pale and get in their cars. It would take months to untangle all of it. But it started that afternoon, on that front step, because an old woman kept a list and 50 strangers decided she was worth standing behind. And then there was the quiet moment, the one that mattered most, that no camera really captured, that the men who were there would carry the rest of their lives. Preacher went and found Opal. She was sitting in the common room, small in her chair, the chaos of badges and notebooks swirling around her, and he crossed to her, and he did something a man his size and his age doesn't do easily. He got down. He knelt, so that his eyes were level with hers, so that for once in 3 years somebody was looking at Opal Hargrove straight on instead of down. And he reached into his cut and took out the photograph. The wedding, the church steps, Ironwood in his ill-fitting suit, and the bride who was laughing. He held it up so she could see it. And the old woman's one good eye filled all the way to the brim. You should have come to us 3 years ago, Opal, Preacher said, and his own voice wasn't steady. The day we lost Raymond, we lost you too, and we never even knew it. You've been family this whole time. Ironwood's family is our family. That doesn't end because a man dies. It never ends. He pressed something into her hand and closed her fingers around it. It was a patch, small and new, made honorary, the kind of thing a club gives to the ones who belong to it by blood and by love, if not by the road. You never have to be afraid again, he said. You never have to be alone again. You've got 50 of us now, and every last one of us should have been here 3 years ago, and we are so sorry that we weren't. But we're here now, and we are not going anywhere. She held that patch against her chest, right next to the dog tags, and she cried the way you cry when a loneliness you'd made your peace with, a loneliness you thought was just the shape of the rest of your life, suddenly and unexpectedly ends. And 50 rough and dangerous-looking people stood in the lot outside, and not one of them, if you'd asked, would have had a dry eye either. She did not get moved that night. Of course she didn't. She went back to a room that got unpacked instead of packed, in a facility that came under new management within the month, scrubbed clean and staffed by people who understood that somebody was watching now and always would be. The residents who'd been robbed were, slowly, over that long year of investigation, made whole again, their money recovered, their names cleared, their confusion revealed for the convenient lie it had always been. And Opal Hargrove was never lonely again. She got a standing Sunday visit every single week, rain or shine, from a rotating cast of the least likely grandchildren a woman ever had. It was Boone, hot-headed Boone, who'd nearly thrown the punch that would have sunk everything, who'd learned the hardest lesson of his young life in that parking lot, who ended up driving her to church most Sundays, easing his big loud machine down to a crawl so the ride would be gentle, waiting in the pew beside her, walking her back out on his arm. The club that the whole town had spent years crossing the road to avoid turned out to be the one thing standing between a corrupt and comfortable system and the forgotten people it fed on. There is a door at the end of a hallway at Cedar Hollow, and on it there is a number, room 114. That morning it had been the door behind which an old woman was being quietly boxed up and ready to vanish. If you'd stood in front of it at dawn, you'd have found it closed, and behind it, fear. But if you go and look now, on a Sunday, you'll find that door standing open, the afternoon sun falling across the floor of a room that is lived in and loved. And you might find Opal Hargrove inside it, packing a small bag, not to be moved, not to be taken anywhere she doesn't want to go, but because a big man on a loud motorcycle is idling in the lot outside, and she is 82 years old, and she has decided that today is a fine day to go for a ride. They look like the most dangerous men in town. They turned out to be the safest place an old woman could ever have run to. And isn't that just the way of it? That the people the world writes off, the ones we've all decided we know everything about, are so often the exact ones who show up when everyone respectable has already gone home. So let me leave you with this. If you believe that no one, not a man in a leather cut, and certainly not a man in a pressed shirt with a lanyard and a clipboard, should ever be allowed to hurt a helpless person and hide behind a smile, then subscribe to this channel, because we are always, every single time, going to take her side. Comment "I stand for justice" one more time, down below, so that the next person who finds this story knows the moment they arrive that they are not alone, that there's a whole crowd of us already standing in that lot. And share this with one person who needs to hear the thing Opal Hargrove learned on the worst and best day of her life, that it is never, ever too late for the right people to show up. Because the next time the club got a call like this one, it wasn't a nursing home. It was a schoolyard. And the person who needed protecting wasn't 82 years old. She was 9. That story is already up, and it's waiting for you right now. Go watch it next.